Pleasure to introduce Massimiliano Demata, who's going to host this seminar for today and is going to introduce our guests. So, Massimiliano, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Marina. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this I-LanD series of I-LanD Research Center seminars. And this time the topic is decolonization and migration. And I'm going to say a few things about that, which I think are particularly relevant about this topic, which is particularly intriguing and indeed very current and up to date. Well, of course, critical discourse studies, critical discourse analysis has always, as a matter of fact, was born looking at the marginal status of certain social groups and migrants, and particularly within the ideology of racism, were a favorite object of inquiry, particularly looking at the way hegemonic discourse would actually marginalize certain groups, and in this case, particularly migrants. With the current situation of crisis, climate change, migration, wars, etc., clearly there's a renewed focus on migration, and clearly so clearly the contextual interdisciplinary approach of critical discourse analysis is particularly useful to address the challenges coming from all these events. The other keyword of today's meeting is, of course, decolonization. Which of course kind of lends itself to several different interpretations. So what do we need? I mean, do we need to decolonize, or what do we need to decolonize? Do we need to decolonize critical discourse analysis as well, actually? Hopefully some of our speakers will also actually may want to address this particular area, because of course critical discourse analysis has predominantly been West oriented, so most scholars are from the West, so maybe we need to decolonize at least partly our field as well. And the other thing, of course, is that the kind of texts that are analyzed, the kind of textuality that is the center of critical discourse analysis, is also mainly Western, for obvious reasons, because in terms of hegemony, of course, it is a Western media that, in a way or another, dominates the narrative worldwide. So maybe we should also learn to focus on migrants' narratives. But without wasting too much time with my ramblings, I would like to introduce the first guest, who is Tommaso Milani. And usually, I think I'm particularly lucky today, because today I have 4 very good friends of mine and 4 great colleagues that I've had the pleasure to work with in several moments at several levels. And what comes quite spontaneous to ask Tommaso every time that we speak is, where are you now? So Tommaso right now is George C. and Jane G. Greer Professor of Applied Linguistics, Jewish Studies, African Studies, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the Pennsylvania State University. And his research aims to understand how power imbalances are reproduced and contested through meaning-making resources, language, visuality, the body, etc. So while identifying strongly with the intellectual tradition of critical discourse analysis, he is not committed to a single theoretical paradigm. And in his analysis of language and power, he has drawn upon different theoretical frameworks, which include, but are not limited to, language ideology, intersectionality, queer theory, Southern decolonial perspectives, and theories of affect. And he has recently completed an externally funded project on language and migration in Sweden. I think everybody is familiar with the format, so we have 4 speakers. Tommaso is the first, and then we'll have the other 3 speakers, and then we'll have a discussion among us, and then, of course, intervention from our audience, which seems to be quite numerous today. So, Tommaso, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Massimiliano, for this lovely presentation, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. So I will not talk about decolonizing critical discourse studies, although there is an excellent special issue of the journal Critical Discourse Studies edited by Viviana de Melo Resende, and I can put the link in the chat later. So I think I have like 10 minutes, and I'm gonna read my remarks. So first, I would like to address some terminology. So what do we mean by decolonization in discourse? In my research, I view decolonization in discourse as a critical approach that seeks to unveil what scholars like Aníbal Quijano and Nelson Maldonado Torres call coloniality. So what is coloniality? And here I'm going to give you the quote from Maldonado Torres. So Maldonado Torres defines coloniality as the long-standing patterns of power that emerge as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administration. So coloniality is something that has continued even after colonialism has ended. Specifically with regard to contemporary migration, the sociologist Adrian Favell, in his thought-provoking book, The Integration Nation, Immigration and Colonial Power in Liberal Democracies, has convincingly argued that integration is the continuation of a long-standing colonial development paradigm. It is how majority-white liberal democracies absorb and benefit from mass migration while maintaining a hierarchy of race and nationality, thus perpetuating global inequalities. So the question that for me as an applied linguist then is, how does such absorbing take place? Over the last 5 years, I've been leading an interdisciplinary research collaboration with colleagues in political science, sociology, and education about language, citizenship, and integration in Sweden. Because of the time constraints, I won't be able to go into all the details of the project. And I can give you like the links to the articles that were already published. So suffices to say that the project focuses on so-called courses in civic integration for newly arrived adult migrants in Sweden. And according to Swedish legislation, the aim of civic orientation is to provide spaces for dialogue and reflection. And such a discussion should take place in migrants' mother tongues. The fact that participatory parity is a key goal of civic orientation in Sweden can be seen even more clearly in the report of the parliamentary inquiry that led to the establishment of these courses that said that civic orientation must be characterized by equal treatment and respect for individual participants. The purpose of civic orientation is to strengthen participants' ability to shape not only their own lives, but also participate in the shaping of Swedish society. So if we just stick to the words of the law, one could argue that the law emphasizes participatory parity for migrants to Sweden. Here, participation and by extension, integration is not framed like in many other countries as a process of fitting into a pre-existing social mold, but as the possibility to contribute to changing social arrangements. And a similar perspective on participatory parity also underlies the rationale for using migrants' mother tongues in civic orientation, namely because, as here I quote again the law, the teaching in Swedish with the help of an interpreter would not provide the same opportunities for active participation with questions and discussions as teaching in their mother tongues. But the question that remains to be answered is, how do the words of the law get operationalized in civic orientation classes? So we have conducted ethnographic work in 6 classes, 3 in Arabic and 3 in English. And on the basis of our participant observations, the answer is, well, the law gets operationalized kind of differently from what it says. So in many ways, the people who are responsible for facilitating discussion in these classes, they're called communicators, they're not called teachers, try to encourage dialogue around the variety of topics. However, while the policy document emphasized how civic orientation should provide migrants with basic knowledge about how Swedish society is organized and also provide this platform for discussion around Swedish society to which migrants could contribute. So it is true that the courses give some information about Swedish society, but we also notice that a substantial amount of time was devoted to what Foucault would call biopolitics. That is a form of regulation that, and here I quote Foucault, exerts a positive influence on life that endeavors to administer, optimize, and multiply it. In civic orientation courses, biopolitics took the shape of a plethora of advice about how to brush one's teeth, which vitamins one should take, how much water one should drink, what types of bread one should eat or not, and how many times one should do pelvic floor exercises in order to avoid urinary incontinence. Crucially, these were not presented as suggestions, but as instructions. For example, it was not uncommon for communicators to ask each participant to promise that it would change their eating or drinking habits. As we have argued in our publications, we do not dispute the nutritional value of some grains or the importance of brushing one's teeth, drinking several liters of water, or doing pelvic floor exercises regularly. What is important to point out is that civic orientation and the integration it advocates is monodirectional and does not create a dialogue based on equal treatment and respect, through which individuals should be able to shape their own lives, but also participate in the shaping of Swedish society as is stated in policy documents. Moreover, based on our ethnographic observations, in this specific case in English and Arabic, these languages, rather than providing the best conditions for dialogue, become conduits through which adult migrants are socialized to become better Swedish citizens than the Swedes, both in the mind and in the body. That equal treatment and respect do not fully inform classes in civic orientation for newly arrived adult migrants also transpires from the innumerable occasions during which a rather homogeneous and essentialized Arab world is presented in negative ways as the antithesis of an otherwise positive Swedish heaven. Such a dichotomy was particularly evident in discussions about the history of Swedish democracy and gender equality. As feminist scholars, we certainly do not wish to downplay the impact that women's struggle has had on Swedish politics and the considerable advancements that have been accomplished with regard to gender equality. However, on the basis of our ethnographic observations, we were surprised that courses that are allegedly built on dialogue and respect only present Western feminist ideas and do not entertain at all discussing alternative feminist traditions such as Islamic feminism, Jewish feminism, indigenous feminism, which might be more relevant for the participants in civic orientation classes. As a result, civic orientation ultimately contributes to reproducing a rather problematic Swedish gender equality mantra that recreates a hierarchical order between an imagined modern, highly developed Swedish we and a less developed other that lacks those attributes. In conclusion, our research illustrates the persistence of the colonial logic according to which the political unity of the nation, and here I quote Homi Bhabha, requires a continual displacement of the anxiety of its irredeemably plural modern space. In civic orientation courses, such apprehension is kept at bay, but what Favell has called a colonial development paradigm, one that assumes that adult migrants to Sweden are less developed and therefore need to be taught everything: what to eat, drink, how to brush one's teeth, and how to successfully manage gender equal intimate relationships. In conclusion, taking into account the current political developments both in Sweden and elsewhere, where there's been a shift to the right, a decolonial approach to migration is more needed than ever, especially in a discipline like applied linguistics, with its focus on real-life problems related to language. However, it is precisely such a critical approach to language and migration that has roused the ire of some scholars in Sweden who bemoan social and political engagement in applied linguistics and other disciplines. They aptly use the positivist rhetoric in order to laminate patently ideological positions with the veneer of scientific objectivity. In doing so, they present themselves as the bastions of good true science against the bad ideological other, me, and other scholars committed to social justice. Perhaps the main challenge is being able to participate in this discussion on equal terms, given that our arguments have already been dismissed a priori by these positive scholars. Not defending social justice in applied linguistics and a decolonial approach to it, however, is not an option. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tommaso. That was absolutely fantastic and full of hints and things to discuss later. Now it's Ilaria's turn. So Ilaria Moschini is a Ilaria is a tenured assistant professor in English language and translation at the Department of Education, Languages, Intercultures, Literatures and Psychology of the University of Florence. She holds a PhD from University College London and is associate member of the University of Southern Denmark Center for Multimodal Communication. Her many research interests are digital discourse and US political and institutional language, which she investigates using critical multimodal discourse analysis integrated with platform studies. So her publications include monographs, articles in leading international journals, and special issues and collections related to linguistics and multimodality. Okay, Ilaria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Massimiliano, and thanks everybody for inviting me to this stimulating seminar. I will read my presentation as well. So I will begin by looking back at 2003. That is a couple of decades ago when I started my scientific career. At that time, my main interest was in political discourse and, to be more precise, in US political and institutional discourse. And the kind of text that I used to take into account were mainly institutional documents or electoral speeches. So there was George W. Bush, there was John Kerry, and then Obama came. And with him, we witnessed an accelerated process of merging electoral discourse first and institutional language then with the language and formats of the web. At that time, I termed this process as the hybridization of discourse. And it was a process that involved genres, registers, styles, but also the very design of the text that began to structurally and exponentially embed other semiotic resources like images, sounds, and so on, as well as elements from digital tools templates. So I expanded my research to encompass digital discourse and, more specifically, social media discourse by investigating Facebook, which was and still is the most influential global infrastructure with its 3 billion active users as per April 2024. Despite, of course, the emergence of challengers like TikTok. So, such a long introduction to tell you that not much has changed in my focus of study, as, in fact, as I'm still dealing deeply with US political discourse, this time expressed by and realized via addresses to stakeholders, about us pages, templates, and API documentation. As Machin and Van Leeuwen affirm, contemporary political discourse manifests itself through many different artifacts. And software is, nowadays, one of the most pervasive ones, mediating and shaping, as it does, our discourses and even our big D discourses. As applied linguists and also multimodalist, how do we tackle such a colonization of discourse? How can we help shed light on such deep, yet, borrowing a term from IT jargon, transparent processes? My position was to adopt a critical multimodal approach to the study of Facebook first and currently Google and YouTube to highlight, among other things, the textual markers of underlying logic and world views. To do this, I had to enrich my toolbox with notions and instruments from IT studies and platform studies, because the text to be taken into consideration go from vertically descending messages, front-end interfaces with templates and social plugins, and API documentation and web services descriptors. This kind of documentation defines the canvases of digital communication, including symmetries and asymmetries, and stretches the boundaries of political discourse, even if it might appear concise and with little interest in a traditional linguistic sense. Going back to textual markers of colonization, those go from the very concept of community, which, as Zuckerberg explains in his so-called Facebook manifesto, intertwines Tocqueville's reflection on the American society with Reingold's virtue communities, to the very peer-to-peer infrastructure, which was framed by Norbert Wiener himself in his book Cybernetics and Society back in 1950 as the enabler of freedom of speech. Peer-to-peer, according to Wiener, is a democratic architectural infrastructure as it postulates the free flow of information among the nodes of a cybernetic system, like the free press does, or better, should do, in socio-political systems that aim to be, or at least be defined, democratic. Thus, it does not come as a surprise that Meta's founding principles rested that their services bring people together as nodes of a rhetorically defined global peer-to-peer infrastructure, but now, to quote Aurora, inside Facebook's walled garden. Or, if YouTube's About Us page until 2021 intertwine Roosevelt's For Freedom speech with Wiener's information freedom. Or, if Google launched Gmail in 2004, designing for it an infrastructure that remodeled emails as conversations among peers to match, on the one side, peer-to-peer structures as conceptualized in Wiener's cybernetics, and the informal stance of hackers' discursive communities. To conclude, my point is that, on the one side, as I have stated earlier, my focus, as you can see, the focus of my studies has not strayed too much from its original topic, as I'm still focusing on US political discourse, even if I am investigating the structures and the institutional documentation of social media. But on the other side, my point, what I'm maintaining, is that a way to reflect on decolonization should probably be that of focusing on aspects that lie behind the surface of traditional digital discourse. Because worldviews, including colonizing worldviews, are imbued in digital tools and ecosystems as infrastructures, not only in text mediated by digital technologies. And I think that, as linguists with a critical approach, we can say something about this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ilaria, for this very interesting presentation. And there's a lot to say about this global peer-to-peer infrastructure that is supposed to be, in fact, global peer-to-peer, etc. But then, of course, it has a very strong kind of colonizing elements, so to speak, inside itself, because, of course, it has been designed by of course, by somebody who is not particularly keen to decolonize. But anyway, next is Katherine Russo, who has a PhD from the University of New South Wales. She's full professor in English and translation at the University of Naples L'Orientale, and her research ranges across the fields of critical discourse analysis, world Englishes, audiovisual translation studies, and her research centers on freedom of movement in EU discourse, climate change and climate-induced migration discourse, hate speech, populist discourse, and social media activism. And she has published numerous articles and edited volumes, including The Representation of Exceptional Migrants in Media Discourse, the case of climate-induced migration. And she's also the author of Practices of Proximity, the Appropriation of English in Australian Indigenous Literature, and of Global English, Transnational Flows, and the Evaluation of Risk in Institutional and Newspaper Discourse, the case of climate change and migration, a book that some of my MA students know pretty well, in fact. Okay, Katherine, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Massimiliano, for your very kind presentation. Thank you also, I-LanD, Marina, and Giuseppe for inviting me to this very interesting seminar, and because it gives me the opportunity to articulate a few thoughts and also to speak about some recent work and some ideas. So I'm just going to really just speak about a few concepts and then see how I've applied them. But I would like to, first of all, say something that I think there has been a very strong neglect of works on colonial discourse in critical discourse studies. As Tommaso was saying before, there is this volume, Coloniality in Discourse Studies, by Solange de Barros and Vivian Resende, but other than that, I mean, it has not really been at the core of let's say, of critical discourse studies. Instead, I think we could simply ask one of the most famous questions in post-colonial critical theory, which was, can the subaltern speak? Now, this was a question that was raised famously by Gayatri Chakravarty-Spivak to interrogate the episteme and to put it with Michel Foucault, the archive of discourse. Or we could also be inspired by the Kenyan author Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who was the first actual writer to coin the term decolonization in a collection of essays, which was entitled Decolonizing the Mind and published in 1986. So in this collection, he wrote about language and its constructive role in national culture, history, and identity. He advocated for linguistic decolonization, and so he became a preeminent voice in the language debate. So while he wrote in English to address a global audience, he announced in this book, Decolonizing the Mind, that he was going to abandon English. And as he put it, language as culture is the collective memory bank of a people's experience in history. Culture is almost indistinguishable from the language that makes possible its genesis, growth, banking, articulation, and indeed its transmission to one generation to the next. So it is part and parcel of the anti-imperialist struggle of Kenyan and African peoples to write in their own language. So in his case, it was Gikuyu. And if you want, his work has always, I always sort of compared it to cognocultural, approaches to language, or, ideas like Sapir-Whorf's approach and so on. And on the other side of this debate, there was another writer, a Nigerian writer, Chinua Achebe, Albert Achebe, who noted in another essay that instead English language could be appropriated. And he said the price of a world language must be prepared to pay is submission to many different kinds of use. I feel that the English language will be able to carry the weight of my African experience, but it will have to be a new English, still in full communion with its ancestral home, but altered to suit its new African surroundings. And in a way, this could be, compared to a Bakhtinian view of language, with appropriation. And as you know, I'm sure everybody knows that then there was Baraj Khatru's inauguration of World Englishes and an idea that language can be appropriated and so on. So the issue here is, can we, for critical discourse studies, can we decolonize language? Can, as Spivak put it, going back to her, can we speak outside colonial discourse when we speak English? Can we speak outside what has been said before and outside a system of language choices that is based on Western ways of knowing and ideologies? This is a question that is central to critical discourse studies, I think, because we have, as critical discourse studies scholars, we often address questions related to ideology and hegemony. So ideology, as put very plainly, is a perspective of worldview composed of related mental representations, convictions, opinions, attitudes, values, and evaluations shared by members of a specific social group, a means for the maintenance of unequal power relations through discourse. And we can, linguistically investigate it through the analysis of omissions, assumptions, taken for granted concepts. So the question here is, what is dominant, invisible, unmarked, normative in a certain discourse? On the other side, on another side, we actually can look at hegemony, and to put it with Antonio Gramsci, the ways through which dominant groups succeed in persuading subordinate groups to accept their own moral, political, and cultural values. And to accept their own moral, political, and cultural values. Hegemony is related to meaning and to structure. I'm so sorry. The ways through which dominant groups succeed in persuading subordinate groups. So hegemony is related to meaning and to struggle over who controls it. So the question here is, how do people, align or disalign with dominant views of, for instance, migration, or what is their attitude towards other mobile subjects, and so on. So, of course, as Massimiliano said before, discrimination against migrants has been at the core of critical discourse studies, and foundational works such as those by Reisegel and Wodak, focusing on the representation of migrants as social actors, and discriminatory linguistic expressions and rhetorical strategies and so on related to this. And instead, Van Dijk argued that the repetitive nature of language realizations and discursive strategies has been so pervasive in the representation of individual migrants and migrant communities that they may be considered as a consequence of the professional culture of journalism. So really pushing this line of inquiry further, we could say that certain events satisfy the news more than others. This famous idea about newsworthiness. So I have recently tried to test this hypothesis by looking at how Twitter or X users reacted to certain representations of mobile subjects during COVID-19. And in fact, as a matter of fact, Twitter users did react to certain nomination strategies, certain ways of representing migrant people, and through, address with hate speech or with solidarity. So it was related to this, and but it's still, what I wanted to address today is that it strikes me that even scholars in CDS sometimes oversee the works of ideology such as Eurocentrism, whiteness, and I think it's an area that is often overlooked. For instance, whiteness as the unmarked and invisible norm on which we base, often our analysis. One other example is I worked on is the this is a very difficult word, vulnerabilization of climate change refugees. So how are climate-induced migrants are represented in the news? And recently I've seen that it's becoming quite popular, work, and Massimiliano himself actually worked on this and published on this. So, the differentiation between climate, the nomination strategy with, climate-induced migrants or refugees. But and so we've worked on that. We linked it to previous studies on migrants, and saw that discrimination practices were similar, no? And this says a lot, because it's not about the specific migrant or the specific context. They are the same patterns that are used all the time. And this tells us that it is indeed based on a stereotypical representation. But what strikes me is that on numerous occasions, climate-induced migrants have stressed that their self-representation is filtered out of news media accounts, and they are often represented as helpless and powerless victims requiring salvation. These representations have been contested by the very groups who are identified as migrants. So even the humanitarian topos that contested this, they have often reclaimed their role as positive agents of change and have stressed their concern over the loss of agency and self-determination related to refugee status, for instance. This is particularly strategic because the type of action, there's a very interesting work by Lili Kuliaraki, I think, that in which she says that the type of action that the sufferer plays out bears an effect on the spectator's own orientation to the sufferer. So if the sufferer is active, we actually relate to the sufferer in a certain way. If they and that is not the same this gives them a human status, of course. So the humane sufferer, she says, and I'm quoting, is the sufferer who acts. So the representation of distant suffering, victims of climate change through the spectacles of news media does not always result in the creation of a global public with a sense of social responsibility, nor orients the spectator towards certain options for action on the suffering and to connect with the spectacle of suffering. So the right to self-representation and to one's own voice may indeed be one of the few repositories of humanity. Another example is that I think, and I've noted this together with Cinzia Bevitori, who I'm working with quite a lot recently on EU climate policies, is that of, colonial discourse in climate change discourse. Also, for instance, we noted that EU was also often described as a pioneer, as the bearer of knowledge, that could help other populations and so on. So, a bit of the white man burden discourse there. This is more or less my work. I'm also participating in a fascinating project on freedom of movement in the EU, which is coordinated by Pascual Perez Paredes. And it's at the moment I'm working on borders, bordering, and formal state membership and symbolic membership, looking at this. And I hope, yes, to see you also at the CADAD conference, where we will be looking at that. Okay, so thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Katherine. This is so interesting and rich. Now, last but not least, of course, is Virginia Zorzi. Virginia is a lecturer in English language and linguistics at the University of Turin. She received a PhD in linguistics, linguistic, philological, and literary sciences from the University of Padova, and her research can be situated within the fields of discourse analysis and contrastive studies, and her work chiefly draws on methods related to corpus linguistics. She has carried out research on the public communication of technoscience, and more recently, she focused her attention on the discourses of technoscience-related conspiracy theories. So her research interests also included the connection between language and gender and migration discourse. And in particular, she has worked on migration terminology in migration law and on migrant narratives online. Okay, Virginia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Massimiliano, for the introduction. And I'm also grateful to all the organizers for having me here, for inviting me. So I had the opportunity to work on migration discourses when I was a research fellow at the University of Bergamo, an opportunity which I'm also very grateful for. One focus of the research project I was involved in was autobiographical narratives of migration, with special attention to the emotions and evaluations in these narratives. And the main reason why it is important to keep our attention on the narratives, the autobiographical narratives of migration, is because they are considered to potentially provide us with tools to counter xenophobic, discriminatory attitudes and behaviors in host societies. As widely acknowledged, migration and people who migrate are predominantly represented negatively through negative stereotypes within host societies' dominant discourses, hence the potential of these narratives to counter that. However, something that caught my attention while I was working on that project was the notion that positive stereotypical images of migrants are also produced. Think about those ideas of people seen as honest, friendly, hardworking, well assimilated into the host society. And these result in what may also be considered powerful and socially sanctioned constructions of, and I put it in between quotation marks, good migrants. And these may also be used by migrants themselves in their stories as a tool to negotiate rights and legitimation. And the outcomes of it might be different than embodying negative stereotypes. However, I would argue they aren't necessarily less discriminatory nor less oppressive. So I became interested in investigating this aspect in online migration narratives with a focus on Western host societies. My question was, if I take a set of these narratives into consideration, will I find mentions or traces of positive stereotypes of migration, maybe in an attempt to overcome societal barriers? And does this surface through emotive and evaluative language, since emotions and evaluation likely play a key role in autobiographical accounts, as well as lying at the center of the research project I was working on? So first of all, I reviewed the literature in search of stereotypical features indicating or predicting favorable attitudes on the part of host populations towards migrants. Discourse studies, on the one hand, have detected positive representations of migrants in media discourse, especially when it comes to describing the positive economic effects brought about by the presence of migrants in terms especially of labor force. Social science research that has mainly focused on the US and European countries has identified other features. For example, migrants tend to be perceived more favorably if they are obviously culturally similar to people in the host country, if they are viewed as hardworking, and if they show loyalty towards the host society. Then there are stereotypes linked to a perceived need for support on the part of migrants, which is paired with a perceived low problem-solving ability. So if migrants have a background of tragic experiences, if they have suffered or are suffering oppression, persecution, discrimination, and here victimhood plays a very important role, they may be viewed more positively. Closely connected to this, people that are acknowledged to have been forced to migrate tend to enjoy more positive attitudes. For the same reason, being a refugee, when not called a bogus refugee, of course, or having a legal immigrant status in a certain country are all elements that contribute to this positive stereotypical representation of the good migrant. So once I reviewed some literature, I decided to focus on a small data set of 29 texts, narratives that I manually collected online. All these documents are in English and told in the first person. They are written or transcribed from video. They come from three main sources. One nonprofit organization called Migration Matters, a project by the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the National Archives of Australia that hosts a section dedicated to memories of migration by people who now live there. It is a very diverse data set in terms of the nationalities involved, of the ages of people involved, and also the historical period when the migration took place. So that needs to be kept into account. So to keep track of emotive and evaluative language, I annotated the texts first according to the attitude system, which is part of Martin and White's appraisal theory. And this allowed me to detect and classify the narrators and other involved actors' feelings, the emotional reaction, that would be the dimension of affect, the evaluation of behaviors, that would be judgment, and also the evaluation of things, of semiotic and natural phenomena and processes that would pertain to the dimension of appreciation. Then in the second part of the analysis, I looked for all the realizations of attitude, and I classified them based on whether they were related or not to the above-mentioned stereotypical features that I have listed before. And if they were related, I classified them according to whether they were consistent with positive stereotypes of migration or divergent from them. Now, let me go over some findings that spread over the whole data set and findings which I considered particularly relevant to my research purposes. I will divide these findings into two main areas. One concerns attitude realizations and the distribution in the data set, and the other area concerns the interplay between attitude and realization and positive stereotypical aspects of migration. So regarding area one, I observed an overall balanced situation between positive and negative emotions and evaluations. Provided that these narratives were published in a spirit of authenticity, I think that this captures well the complexity of migration experiences, which news media tend to represent in polarized and simplistic terms as complete tragedies or utter successes or tragedies turned success. One more aspect I noticed concerns a particular subset of affect, inclination, disinclination, whose realizations range from the expression of fear to the expression of desire towards something. And this was used to refer to narrators' migration project. Their hopes, their desires, I wish, my hopes and dreams, their frustration, their sense of achievement. And this enhances the human and individual dimension of these experiences rather than, say, awareness of socio-political dynamics, for example. Regarding area two of my findings, that is the interplay between attitudes, realizations, and positive stereotypical aspects, my analysis suggests the presence of attitude consistent with the stereotypical features of suffering, hardship, victimization, and loyalty towards the host society, as well as hard work. For example, the attitude subcategory of judgment was used to negatively evaluate discriminatory behaviors experienced by migrants. At the same time, positive judgment was used to evaluate hardworking behaviors on the part of migrants themselves. So working hard was valued in this data set. In other instances that are not specifically focused on discrimination, suffering and hardship were most often conveyed through the subtype of appreciation, that is the evaluation of things. So people placed the focus on the situations, the objects, and the people who triggered their emotions, describing them with adjectives such as hard, difficult, shocking, instead of focusing on themselves as emoters. At the same time, attitude, so now I'm considering those realizations that are not fully consistent with positive stereotypes. Attitude also marked various degrees of cultural distance between migrants and host societies, which counters the stereotypical feature of emphasizing the similarity between migrants and host societies. More in general, the picture I have been trying to describe is one where attitude is largely used in ways that might recall positive stereotypes of migration. Even in these cases, it must be said that stereotype consistent elements were sometimes made more complex. They were reframed through stereotype divergent features. So, for example, a speaker might express their will to be a good person for the host country, but at the same time, few lines later, they might refer to the host country as an instrument for the realization of their own project, of their own dreams. It must also be noted that emotive and evaluative language consistent with the positive stereotypes was never used to distinguish between good and bad people, which is important and has happened, for instance, in personal accounts analyzed in other studies. Yet, even considering that consistency with positive stereotypes does not imply that you are subscribing or intentionally exploiting them, the question arises about whether anything would change in the reception of these narratives had these mentions of, say, suffering, hard work not been made prominent, or if speakers had not experienced them with such intensity. So I believe that we should strive to address this issue and to address dominant discourses and the essentialized image that they support, whether they are positively or negatively perceived by the hegemonic groups. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Virginia. Yeah, I think we had 4 quite different presentations, but yet at the same time, I think there are a few common themes that can be explored and exploited by us in our discussion. I think the issue of host societies clearly, surfaces everywhere in all of your presentations at various levels, with level of infrastructure, level, cultural level, linguistic level, and so on and so forth. I think there are issues also of accessibility, and also of media as being both language as a medium, but also as in the case of Ilaria, as in Ilaria's case, the whole social media infrastructure that can grant, allow, or deny access to people and to certain voices. So it's really a matter of if I can use a sentence, so who says what to whom and where and how, and what kind of domination is actually expressed. So it seems to me that yes, we talk about decolonization, but in some cases we can even talk about recolonization in certain, in some cases, particularly when it comes to and I'm kind of taking the hint from Tommaso's presentation in the civic orientation. So you teach migrants to be Swedish citizens. So in a way, they are recolonized somehow, paradoxically. But yeah, that's basically the reality. The same thing that happened, at some other level with Katherine's presentation, when Katherine said that, speaking of the voice of people, actually the voice of migrants, and the fact that climate migrants and climate refugees actually do not agree with most of the representations that are made about them, of them by mainly Western, mainly white privileged media. And of course, Ilaria and Virginia both said several, very similar things about Ilaria, the complex infrastructure of social media, particularly Facebook, and Virginia, in the case of of course, migrants and how stereotypes play a certain role in representing or misrepresenting them. So I would like you maybe to address this kind of common thread that we can identify. So accessibility. So whose voice do we hear? Are we allowed? Can we hear that voice? I mean, those voices. And of course, I particularly enjoy the Catherine's mention of Gayatri Spivak in that context. So I wonder whether we can make something out of all these little hints and threads that I have outlined here. Tommaso, maybe?
Yeah, I mean the issue is like whose voice is heard, is a very good, it's really a very good question. And how is it possible, to hear some migrants' voices or not, right? So I mean, in the case of Sweden, which I studied, of course, I mean, there are positive examples as well, right? There are what our research shows is really focusing on these specific courses in civics and kind of in a way you could say that in a typical critical discourse analytical tradition, we are more interested about how the state operates, right, rather than looking at necessarily what migrants do, right? Although what it emerged in through our ethnography is that migrants, there was some form of resistance against these discourses from the state. They were kind of trickling down through these communicators, but there was also we could see a lot of kind of desire to please the state. And of course, that's not so surprising. I mean, migrants who arrive in Sweden and want to have permanent residence, I mean, they're gonna say, sure, I'm gonna drink 3 liters of water a day. Yes, I'm only gonna eat rye bread, and I will stop eating pita, if you tell me so. It's also, I mean, we don't know whether they actually changed their behaviors at home, right? Could be just like this kind of ventriloquizing a specific institutional discourse for the sake of just getting this course done, having the certificate, and move on, right? So, but I guess what I want to reiterate, because Sweden has this, I mean, around the world, I mean, everyone thinks that Sweden is this kind of paradise on earth. And Sweden has successfully presented itself as some kind of paradise on earth in terms of gender equality and I mean, up until very recently, more open frontiers than other countries. But there is a huge discrepancy between what Sweden says in policy and then how the policy is implemented and what happens then in practice. And I'm gonna stop here for now.
Okay, thank you, Tommaso. Ilaria, maybe, or Katherine, or whoever.
Well, I was interested in Tommaso's presentation. I was wondering, what about schools? Because as an Italian living between Denmark and Italy, so what I see is that in schools, I mean, there are many practices and also related discourses that do challenge different identities, not only those of migrants, also the so-called economic migrants that are not Western economic migrants that are not perceived as more expats than migrants, okay, the term that defines an asymmetric representation of migratory statuses. So what about schools in Sweden?
So you mean like secondary school and
No,
primary?
more primary and middle schools, because it's from
Yeah.
the...
So again, I mean, the courses that we followed were very much courses for adult migrants, right? You know, so these are kind of courses that happen in the afternoon, also because, and they're very much taken by newly arrived migrants, right? Because they are also the ones who are part of the employment. They have registered themselves at the employment agency, and as they try to learn Swedish, you know, with the Swedish for immigrant courses, they are also taking these courses. I mean, what happens? I'm not really. I mean, there is quite a lot. I mean, there is quite a lot of research about migrants. So, in other words, younger migrants, you know, children and adolescents, and how then migrants are represented in school or not, and their lived experiences. It's not really the kind of research that I have been doing. And of course, the picture is differs enormously from school to school, from urban area to urban area. So I don't think that one can draw huge generalizations about Swedish schools. Again, there is. We have to remember, I mean, that Sweden, because of its 50 years of social democracy, which, however, now Sweden no longer has a social democratic government at the moment, but the 50 years of social democracy have been characterized by this type of social engineering that seeks to create this perfect society. But this social engineering has been very much characterized by hegemonic whiteness and the idea that what is good for everyone is being based on what is good for a specific segment of the population. And the social engineering mentality, the social engineering logic is still in place, but it hasn't changed. But okay, we need to think it differently because Swedish society has actually changed, right? You know, and so what you think is good today, or what is the social good today, is not what the social good was, 50 years ago.
Thank you. And if I may add briefly, what was interesting in my direct experience was the clashing of social engineering because Denmark is for many aspects similar to Sweden. So social engineering clashing in schools and with the use of Google for Education. So another type of social engineering. So there was this huge clash, and still is there, regarding whose voice is heard or who is shaping your voices. So it's interesting how all those layers do match. So thank you.
Yes, and of course, Google is not neutral. Okay. Katherine.
Yes, well, just to go back to your question, Massimiliano, I think, yes, it depends obviously on, the media outlet and as we were saying just now, who is behind it and what are the media outlets that are, obviously more powerful and so on. But yes, there is a very scarce accessibility for, the actual migrants to have a voice in news discourse and so on. And so actually what is interesting today is to look maybe at social media, where there is obviously a direct access. But also I've been interested in this approach by Michal Krzyżanowski, who actually went back to some studies on migrant narratives, and together with Rick Wodak has thought about this discourse ethnographic approach, where there is somehow an interrogation of what of these narratives, taking into consideration these narratives, and also Anna De Fina's work, of course, and the narrative analysis. So yes, I think there's much work to be done, though, because it's not just about, okay, if I'm interviewing one representative, one migrant representative, how is the reporter then, using certain, reporting verbs, or how is it framed, how is it used? And it's also, that is also, I think the question. So even if they do have access, then they are immediately, colonized. And I liked your idea of recolonization, especially in light of recent moves towards, the far right, or renationalizing tendencies. I've been recently thinking about a lot, as I said before, freedom of movement in the EU. This concept that we often take for granted, and instead social studies, people in social studies or in political studies have been claiming that it is becoming more and more a conditional right, where people think about it as conditional. It is granted with some conditions, and bordering and rebordering the completely arbitrary, bordering, rebordering practices. And yes, that I think we should really interrogate that, and obviously how borders are based on whiteness, and who is free to circulate. For instance, who is a mobile subject, who's an expat, these kind of things. I think our work is really fundamental, to think about these nomination strategies, and also how everything that goes, around with it, that actually creates certain connotations and certain given for granted concepts and ideologies, So that's, I don't know if it's helpful or if it answers your question, but.
Oh, it is. It does. It is very helpful. Absolutely. No, I totally agree with you with bordering and rebordering. In the face of globalization, as we all know, borders are alive and well, and they are still always there. They're still there. They will always be there in the foreseeable future, just to emphasize the power, the central power of the state, and and the prerogatives that the state has to admit or refuse access, as well as to define or deny, to give or to deny identity to people. So no, that's absolutely relevant in this context.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Virginia?
So concerning the question, whose voice do we hear? What I was thinking about while also listening to this whole discussion, also regarding accessibility, and this idea that as soon as some people access some media, some recolonization might occur. What came to my mind was that the narratives of migration that were at the center of the project I worked on and studied in many other projects are something that is mainly, I think, produced for a Western audience, for audiences of receiving societies, of host societies. And this says something already. These are products that we as host populations should consume. And they are shaped in a way that we can consume them. This, of course, I don't believe that being exposed to anybody's voice is damaging. And I think that we do need people to tell about their experiences, their backgrounds of migration. At the same time, we should probably be aware that the way that stories are shaped, especially when they are packaged by projects and released and published in sources such as the ones I analyzed, for example, they are already pre-shaped in a way that we can enjoy, let's say, and this can be problematic. One more thing that relates to this is I was speaking to somebody who works in cultural mediation with people coming from Africa here in Italy, and they told me they have experience of people applying for refugee status and having to answer a set of questions. They told me it is, in some cases, it is very difficult to draw a story out of the direct voice of the people who come here. Because the idea of story that, the ideas of stories that we have are completely different. And also, many of the people who come here and that are most heavily discriminated against are part of the most vulnerable groups in their countries of origin as well. People who are trafficked and arrive here, for example. So there are a lot of obstacles stopping us from actually hearing some voices, I believe. Maybe our wish to hear those voices is also one obstacle, and there are many others. So yeah, I know that I have listed a series of problems that I have no solution for, even because my experience with migration discourses and studies related to migration is quite short, actually. But yes, I wanted to point this out because I think it's relevant.
I think Katherine raised her hand, I think.
Yes, I just wanted to say something very brief about what Virginia was saying, because I think it's very stimulating. And also I really appreciated what you said before about your work, about your research. I think it's incredibly interesting. Yes, there is also often this packaging, as you were saying, packaging of certain narratives. And that is the reason why I think people doing interviews and so on, and, you know, working by looking actually at interviews or even other data, you know, I mean, the idea is that it then contradicts your views as a researcher. For instance, now we're collecting 100 stories by mobile subjects in the EU, but they're mobile subjects from the EU moving to another country in the EU. And so you think, obviously, you think that you will get a certain views, or maybe that are similar to yours, that are, open to, migration and so on. But then you'll find something completely different, of different opinions that you don't expect. And that is really important. I think we should always go back to, to discourse, to our, role as, researchers that don't want to impose a certain view on that and so on. Going back to that. And yes, we are consumers. As I was saying, I'm sometimes really deeply affected also by colleagues that sometimes in a very maybe good-hearted way, but they have this humanitarian stance, which is really disempowering, and they maybe don't realize, I think. But we're fed that so much, even through advertising about when they're asking us for money and so on and so forth. It's very, it's there. It's a discourse that is very, very, widespread, and it's appealing to emotions, obviously. But we're still consuming a certain representation. And yeah, so I think But when I've actually read, you know, narratives or interviews or even speaking with people, they want to be seen, the discourse about migration as a positive addition to the host country. You know, you're doing something good for them. You know, you're a positive agent of change, or you're bringing something to the country, is so, you know, it's so limited. We don't really see it, and I think that we need to give it more space, I think. That's what I meant by, you know, actually giving voice, or, you know, thinking about other narratives, obviously, other narratives.
Oh, yes, yes, absolutely. Okay, well, I wonder whether there is any question or comment from our audience. Maria Concetta Mirto, I think.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank all the speakers for the incredible speech. And my question is about Professor Milani's speech. I want your opinion. Do you think that Sweden could be, the case study of Sweden could be a case related to the sempiternal battle between integration and inclusion, in terms that integration can be seen as the host country gives rules and migrants must apply that rules, while inclusion is a kind of more soft dialogue between cultures, and so a way of make both the host countries and migrants grow. I don't know if I was clear.
Very clear, crystal clear. So I'm not sure I agree with the distinction between integration and inclusion, because in my view, they are both problematic. So whenever I've given lecture, like in Sweden, like people think that I'm completely, you know, crazy, right? But I typically want to tell people that we need to ask a very, very different question. So because both underpinning both integration and inclusion is this idea based on the metaphor, or like in many ways the family, like, you know, or you come to my family, then, like, you know, you have to somehow abide by some of the rules that we have established here. It's like, that's a way of doing this, but we have seen that it doesn't work, right? You know, it really doesn't work. So how can we instead take migration as a starting point from which to completely rethink the societies in which we live right now? How can we take these experiences of the migrants as the starting point for rethinking who we are, and how that we can become a more capacious we, rather than you are integrated or you are included into a pre-existing we, right? Am I making sense?
Totally. Thank
I
you.
mean, it wasn't a critique about your question. I think your question
No,
is...
No, I didn't perceive it like that. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Maria Concetta and Tommaso. Okay. Any other question or reflection, comment from the audience? Marina, I think.
Oh, yes. First of all, thanks to all our wonderful speakers. And there were a lot of very interesting concepts and many words that, you know, I do agree with you that some of them are still quite problematic. Also, you know, the the boundaries between inclusion and integration, which also leads to appropriation somehow. Because my feeling, I'm not an expert in this field, but my feeling is that once migrants are actually integrated, into societies of the host countries, they are accused of cultural appropriation. This comes to my mind. I think of some food bloggers. They're foreigners, but they work in Italy. And so they cook Italian food, Italian recipes. And so some comments, they are, they accuse them. They say, oh, but why don't you cook, I don't know, foods from your country, Italian food. So what do you think about this very, very difficult process? I mean, when does integration end? I don't know if this is clear. It's just, a reflection that came to my mind.
Was the question directed to me or to everyone? Okay.
Yes, to everyone.
Who would like to answer?
I think will. Oh, okay. Sorry.
No, go, please go.
That will be very, very quick. I mean, it's like, I think it never ends. I mean, it's like, it is an ongoing process. And in this, it is a process that also involves our own definition as belonging to the original we as a community. So it's like a reinforcing of boundaries, like for us as intended as the regional with all the quotation markers, community, as reinforcing boundaries, stereotypes, and a sort of homogeneous kind of definition that actually we never have in society, and a continuous renegotiation of by oppositions and so on. So it never, in my opinion, it never ends.
Maybe Katherine was about to say something.
Oh, no, I wanted to say that I think Tommaso is probably the most suited, but but to answer this, I don't think it ever ends as well. To me, the two things come to mind. I mean, the fact is that it's about social identity. It's about the fact that we may have different identities, shifting throughout the same day. The fact that it's more about identification. It's more about, and sometimes it's a stronger identification. Let's say with food, I might strongly identify with food, with a certain food at a certain point, and depends also on how I'm relating to that interlocutor and so on. I say this because being, Italian and Australian, I often change. It depends on the situation, and it's also about, yes, as we were saying, I think today we're thinking about colonization, whiteness. We talked about whiteness. So the fact of blackness, the idea that you only realize, people, Frantz Fanon famously said, that he only became black when a little boy said, "Oh, look, a black guy." I mean, sometimes it's how it feels, when you encounter somebody and they just want to, put you in this box and just, say that's who you are, and, go back to that box, because otherwise, you might upset me. But yeah. So yes, it changes all the time, and it depends on, the people you're encountering, perhaps, and also you might, feel more strongly, or it's a change. It's change all the time, I think, and you might have a stronger or weaker attachment to certain things, and yeah, I don't know, Tommaso, maybe that was a bit of a ramble, but.
Okay, so I take the opportunity again to be a bit provocative. Instead of saying that it never ends, for some people like me, it never began. So, but of course, you know, one has to be careful about romanticizing like my or overgeneralizing my experience, because I mean, I actively refuse to be integrated into into Swedish society, because I perceived it as being kind of forced into a straitjacket of being, you know, this kind of biopolitical. Which I mean, I didn't attend those courses in civic orientations, but you know, I've throughout the years that I was in Sweden, there was a constant attempt to contain me, despite Sweden be like, you know, this again, this LGBT paradise, but certain queer bodies are need to be contained, and certain queer migrants need to be contained. And despite the fact that it was, of course, white, cisgender, middle class, but there was this constant attempt to contain me, which then, of course, produced this reaction of I do not want to be integrated. I do not want to fit in. Of course, it's easier said and done by someone who is, you know, a professor, who is privileged, who has a certain salary, who can do certain things. Of course, if you don't have certain advantages, not everyone can resist, right? You know, the systems. That's why I said we need to be very, very cautious about who has the privilege of saying, I do not want to fit in, right?
Yes, I think Tommaso is absolutely right. I mean, we have this kind of pressure of homogenizing into a model, which is the dominant model, or it is perceived as a dominant model. But as Marina said, very often these models are indeed, they are dominant, they appear to be so, but they're not entirely 100% real, you know, because, you know, of course, there are always exceptions, although we tend not to see the exceptions. We see the postcard, but we don't see the exceptions, so there's more details in the postcard, so to speak. And in fact, you know, let's not underestimate the importance of food as a, you know, a very important cultural marker. In fact, you know, Marina herself actually noticed that. And what Marina said actually reminded me of a short YouTube video from Little Britain, which is in itself actually the triumph of how certain stereotypes are challenged and partly even celebrated when this policeman asks this person from clear Indian origin, so what's your favorite food? And he said, oh, fish and chips. So you don't like curry? No, I don't know what curry is. So anyway, so it kind of, you know, challenges stereotypes. And as Tommaso said, it is perhaps more, it's perhaps easier to do that in a position of privilege. Whereas if you are somehow in a subordinate position, you know, things can become very difficult because the pressure to integrate is very strong. Also because that is also somehow exchanged with, okay, you integrate, I give you an identity, so to speak. So, and the Tommaso's project somehow, I mean, the project that Tommaso talked about is a bit like that. But I think Anna wanted to say something. We cannot hear you.
Can you hear me?
No? Too low. We cannot hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Better?
Try to shout a little bit.
Am I shouting now for you? Is that okay? No, really. Okay, I'll take this off. Can you hear me now?
Actually,
Yes.
better.
Okay, all right. Well, first of all, thank you everybody for sharing your research interest and insights in activities of applying discourse analysis to post-colonial theories and studies. And actually, I would like you to expand, if possible, if time limits could allow that, on the risks and benefits of using discourse analysis and applying discourse analysis to post-colonial theory. Because it seems to me that on one side, and maybe you have that something into that especially Katherine, there is a risk of, you know, ending up doing the same research on cultural appropriation or reappropriation Orientalism, us versus them, you know. But then on the other side, maybe it is a possibility of doing some research applying this kind of criticism to modern form of colonialism, modern or neo-colonialism, modern form of global imperialism, and probably focusing also on economic policies, political choices, contemporary political choices, rather than looking back, you know, always at literature and literary production.
Thank you for that question. I mean, this was just my way of, you know, starting the discussion on decolonization and drawing a parallel between, you know, fundamental questions that I think, you know, can be the same fundamental questions. You know, post-colonial studies were never about us and them. I think that's a bit of a simplification of post-colonial studies. It was always about decolonizing discourse, decolonizing language, and the decolonizing, you know, representation, which is it's different. It's about reading against, you know, a reading against the grain. No, it's reading against, you know, post-colonial was always about not post as something after, coming after colonialism, but some like a bit like post-structuralism, you know, the structure, you know, and so I think that some CDS does exactly this. In fact, its theoretical roots are the same because it's stemming from social constructionism, which is, you know, at its roots, it's about obviously deconstructing knowledge, you know, ways of knowing, and so on. So yes, mine was not, you know, an attempt to go back to post-colonial literature or post-colonial studies and so on. But I'm just saying that I think that today's webinar was so interesting because it put it on the table. It put on the table decolonization, and I think that we don't see a lot of that in critical discourse studies. We don't, as I said recently, I've been struck by the fact that we don't really look at ideology in that sense. We don't look at colonial ideologies or whiteness as the invisible norm of, you know, Western discourse and so on. So I was just calling the attention on that, and if you want, you know, the idea that we are always preceded by discourse, you know, as Ilaria was saying, you know, the big D, you know, we are, whatever we say has already been said, and therefore we can't get outside it. So that is, I think, a very common root behind it, and it's yes. So I think, and apart from this work that also Tommaso mentioned, I mean, I don't know about much work in this, and I think it's fascinating. And as I said, I was really struck by a lot of colonial discourse in policies, EU policies on climate change. I mean, it was quite evident to me. But you know, when you hear some terms and you say, "Oh, I know this," you know, I know this. Where is it coming from? And that is where I think it's quite, yeah, this interesting, really, that Europe still thinks about itself as the bearer of knowledge, and you know, the center of know-how, of knowledge, and that it can export that knowledge to the world. Where I think, you know, in the climate change is showing us exactly the opposite. So yeah, I hope that answers your questions, Anna. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to share that.
Thank you. Yes, as I can't remember his name now. About 6 months ago, 7, 8, maybe 9 months ago, a EU officer said, Europe is a garden. So a garden has to be defended. We have to build a wall around Europe. So and outside the garden there's a jungle. So a jungle is dangerous, and so on and so forth. So certain colonizing discourses are still there. They're still there at the highest institutional level. He apologized then later and said, "Oh, that was only a metaphor." But I think if you say it's a metaphor, it probably make matters even worse, I think.
Yeah.
So any other reflection? Virginia, yes.
Yes, what you and Katherine also said made me think about the fact that we take so much for granted that we are our wealth, right? It is so much taken for granted, but it is our wealth, and I'm speaking about how we live in most countries of the European Union, is based on inequality, is based on borders and on keeping out certain people, and on a past that was also a colonial past that built upon which our wealth is built. And probably if this hasn't yet been fully addressed, it is also a matter of discourse. And probably if anybody wants to engage in critical discourse studies, what we may want to address is the normalization of all of these assumptions, that we are a garden, that we know better, that we have the right laws, but all of our system was built around certain boundary making. And so probably it is very abstract what I am thinking about, but the role of critical discourse studies is to go where these things are normalized in discourse and try to deconstruct this. And then there's also a lot of work to do, I believe, around integration and inclusion, because integration and inclusion are indeed a problematic. I fully agree. And but I don't know whether we as societies can afford to call that into question. So how can that happen is another question I ask myself all the time. So yeah, that was my thought on several of the things that have been said.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, any other comment or question to our speakers?
You'll find the link that you were talking about in the chat box.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I always forget the name of the person. What's his name?
Joseph Borrell? Joseph Borrell?
Yes, that's right. Yes. Joseph Borrell. Yes, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting remark. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Any other comment? I think we can put Marina, what do you think?
I can simply add something. Can you hear me? Giuseppe
Yes.
speaking.
Giuseppe.
Yeah, I cannot show my face. It's much better not to. Otherwise, we're going to open up new types of discourses here. I just want to thank everyone because it was quite interesting. I really appreciated the whole afternoon with you. I was also thinking of a different form of, let's say, colonizing instrument that, of course, is going to somehow overwhelm the way we look at our contemporary world. That is to say, artificial intelligence. It's totally different. Of course, we're actually moving on to a completely different type of world and realm, but still, that form of colonization is going to be linguistic varieties. This is what they're trying to do as well, and also somehow to press what we know as, the whole concept of diversity, if you like. Virginia would say something interesting about deconstructing normalization, which is fundamental, especially today. But when we deal with artificial intelligence, can we really do that? Would we really look at that as a new form of colonization? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. Who would like to answer? Maybe Virginia, actually, who is probably closer to this areas.
Well, actually, not that much, because I lack the technical competence to actually answer the question. What I know is that artificial intelligence is not what probably the public discourse thinks it is, because we treat it as intelligence, which it is not. We treat it as human. Sometimes we humanize it, which it's not the case. And since it does reproduce a lot of it is based on the material that we produce, of course, it will be problematic. It will always be. I don't think there's much we can do about it, judging from what happened with smartphones and social media. I think that something similar will probably happen with AI. It will become widely available, and who knows? We cannot really imagine the actual outcomes, but at least being aware of how problematic it can be. And also, I've heard about, I cannot reference it straight away because I can't remember. I think it was an article on Decolonisation on people doing some teaching that said that artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, could be used to let students evaluate the outputs in a critical way. So using artificial intelligence as something to be evaluated. So what is this output telling you? Is it really objective? What are the nuances that you can see in it? So that might be a way to address it, but I don't really know how to pair it with post-colonial concerns. That would require some time for me to think over. But thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Oh, sorry. That was I didn't want to raise my hand. Sorry, I wanted to switch off my mic.
Okay. If there is no other comment, Marina, I think we can probably draw that to a close.
Yes.
And I would like to thank Katherine, Ilaria, Tommaso, and Virginia for all of this, and of course Marina for organizing it. And I think Antonio also played some role in the organization, I believe. And Marina, I'll leave you the last words.
Okay. Thank you, Massimiliano, for brilliantly leading this session, and to our speakers and to our audience, as always. So today it was really, really stimulating, and there were a lot of very, very interesting topics that we don't get to hear very often about. So I'm really glad of it. And so our next seminar will be on May 16th, and it will be on new issues in translation studies and practice. So once again, I hope you can all be there, and see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.